Many avoidants feel it in relationships, but almost never say. It doesn't come out as anger. It doesn't show up as conflict. It doesn't get expressed directly. But over time, it builds, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly, a form of resentment. That doesn't sound like you did something wrong. It sounds more like this feels like too much, even when nothing obvious is wrong. Because for many avoidants, the hardest emotions are not the ones they express, they're the ones they carry in silence. Resentment is usually imagined as something loud, arguments, frustration, clear complaints. But for the avoidance system, resentment doesn't look like that. It forms quietly, without confrontation, without explanation, without release. Because avoidants often don't process emotions externally, they process them internally, privately, silently. And when emotions aren't expressed, they don't disappear, they accumulate. In relationships, this creates a very specific pattern. The avoidant may appear calm, easygoing, unbothered. They don't complain much. They don't demand much. They don't always react to things that might bother other people. From the outside, this can look like emotional stability. But internally, something else can be happening. They are noticing things, feeling things, reacting internally, but not expressing it. Small moments begin to add up. Expectations, emotional demands, subtle pressure to be present, to respond, to engage at a certain level. None of these things are necessarily wrong. They are part of normal connection. But for the avoidance system, they can feel like an increasing load because what looks like closeness from one side can feel like obligation on the other, not intentionally, but experientially. The need to reply, the need to show up, the need to stay engaged, the need to be available, all of it adds weight, not overwhelming at first, but cumulative. And because the avoidant doesn't express that weight openly, it has nowhere to go. So it stays inside. It builds slowly, quietly, without release. This is where resentment begins, not as anger toward the other person, but as internal pressure, a sense of, I have to keep giving, I have to keep showing up, I can't fully step back, even if no one explicitly asked for that. The resentment is not always about what's happening. It's about how it's being experienced through a system that values autonomy, control, emotional independence. So when connection starts requiring consistency, presence, emotional availability, it can feel like something is being taken, even if it's being given willingly. And because this feeling is not spoken, it becomes invisible. The partner doesn't see it. The relationship continues. Everything appears fine. But internally, the weight grows. Over time, this creates a subtle shift. The avoidant may become less emotionally available, less responsive, less engaged. Not suddenly, gradually, because the system is trying to reduce the internal load. But from the outside, this shift feels confusing because it doesn't follow a clear event, no argument, no conflict, no obvious breakdown, just distance. And underneath that distance, there's often something no one is talking about, the quiet resentment that formed not from conflict, but from unexpressed emotional burden. The quiet resentment doesn't begin as resentment. It begins as small moments that go unspoken. A message they didn't feel like answering, but replied to anyway. Time spent when they needed space, but didn't say it. Emotional conversations they stayed in while feeling internally overextended. None of these moments seem significant on their own. They're normal, expected, part of being in a relationship. But for the avoidance system, each one registers, not as connection, as effort, because effort for an avoidant is not just action, it's emotional output, staying present when the system wants to withdraw, engaging when the internal state feels full, responding when there is a need for space. And when that happens repeatedly, something starts to form, a quiet imbalance, not visible externally, but felt internally. I'm giving more than I have capacity for. I'm staying when I want to step back. I'm showing up while feeling overwhelmed. But because these thoughts are not expressed, they don't become dialogue. They become accumulation. There is also another layer that intensifies this: the lack of boundaries. Not because avoidants don't have them, but because they don't always communicate them early. They feel the limit, but they don't say it. They sense they need space, but they don't take it immediately. They notice emotional pressure, but they don't name it. So instead of creating clear boundaries, they stretch, adjust, accommodate, and over time, that stretching creates strain because the system is going beyond what feels natural, beyond what feels regulated, beyond what feels sustainable. But since it's happening quietly, no one else sees it. This is where resentment deepens, not toward a specific action, but toward the experience itself. The feeling of being pulled into something that requires more than they can comfortably give, even if they participated in it, even if they didn't say no. And this is the hidden paradox. The avoidant may feel overwhelmed by a dynamic they never openly resisted. They may feel burdened by expectations they never clearly declined. They may feel pressure in a connection that was never explicitly demanding, because the pressure was internal, created by unspoken limits, unexpressed needs, uncommunicated boundaries. Over time, this begins to change perception. The relationship no longer feels like just connection. It starts to feel like responsibility, something that must be maintained, something that requires energy, something that cannot easily be stepped away from. And when connection starts to feel like that, resentment grows faster, because now the system is not just managing emotion, it's managing obligation. This is when subtle thoughts appear. I don't have space. This is a lot. I need room. Not always clearly. Sometimes just as a feeling, a heaviness, a resistance that builds over time. But again, it's not expressed. So instead of being addressed, it continues to accumulate, layer by layer, moment by moment, until eventually the system needs relief, not through conversation, through distance. And that's when the shift becomes visible: less engagement, less availability, less emotional presence. Because now the system is no longer just managing, it's correcting, trying to reduce the internal pressure that has been building for so long. From the outside, this feels sudden, but from the inside, it's overdue. The result of everything that was never said, everything that was never released, everything that quietly turned into resentment. When the resentment has been building for long enough, it doesn't come out as expression. It comes out as distance. Not dramatic, not explosive, controlled, measured, quiet. The avoidant doesn't suddenly start arguing. They don't confront. They don't list everything that's been bothering them. Instead, they begin to withdraw. Less energy, less presence, less emotional availability. At first it's subtle, slightly slower replies, less enthusiasm, less depth in conversation. Nothing obvious, but something feels different. From the outside, this creates confusion because there was no conflict, no clear issue, no moment where something went wrong. So the distance feels unexplainable. But internally, it makes perfect sense because the system has reached a point where it can no longer carry the accumulated load. And since that load was never expressed, it can only be released through reduction, less interaction, less engagement, less closeness. This is where resentment becomes visible, not through words, through behavior. The avoidance starts pulling back from the very connection they once participated in. And here's what makes it complex. The other person often responds by moving closer, trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to reconnect. More effort, more communication, more emotional presence. But that response intensifies the problem because now the avoidance system feels even more pressure, more expectation, more engagement, more emotional demand. And when resentment is already present, additional demand doesn't repair the connection, it deepens the resistance. So the avoidant withdraws further, not aggressively, but consistently, creating more space, more distance, more separation. This creates a painful loop. You feel them pulling away. You move closer. They feel overwhelmed. They move further. You try harder. They disengage more. And underneath that entire dynamic, there's something no one is addressing: the resentment that was never spoken. Inside the avoidant, the experience is conflicting because part of them still cares, still values the connection, still remembers why they chose it, but another part feels drained, overextended, internally pressured. And those two parts don't integrate, they compete. One pulling toward connection, one pulling toward relief. Relief often wins, not because the connection is not important, but because the system is trying to restore balance, to release what has been building for too long. This is why avoidance can seem emotionally distant without clear reason, because the reason was never expressed in real time. It was accumulated, and by the time it becomes visible, it's no longer about one moment. It's about everything that wasn't said, everything that wasn't set as a boundary, everything that was carried in silence. Understanding this changes the way you interpret their withdrawal, because it's not always a loss of feeling. It's often a release of pressure. But because that pressure was never shared, the release feels like rejection, even when it wasn't meant to be. And this is the core of the pattern. Unspoken limits turn into internal strain. Internal strain turns into resentment. Resentment turns into distance. The hardest part about quiet resentment is that it hides in plain sight. There's no argument to point to, no clear moment where things broke, no conversation that explains what changed, just a slow shift from openness to distance. And because nothing was said, everything feels confusing. You try to understand, you replay moments, you wonder what you missed. But the truth is, there was nothing obvious to see because the real issue was never expressed out loud. This is why you can't fix this pattern by trying harder. More effort doesn't resolve unspoken resentment. More presence doesn't release internal pressure. More emotional giving doesn't undo what was never communicated, because the problem was not a lack of connection. It was a lack of expression, a lack of clear boundaries, a lack of real-time honesty about capacity. And once resentment reaches a certain point, the system doesn't ask for repair. It moves toward relief, through distance, through disengagement, through pulling back from what feels like too much. This is where your clarity matters, because you can spend a lot of time trying to fix what was never spoken, trying to understand what was never explained, trying to reconnect with someone who is already internally pulling away. Or you can see the pattern clearly, not as rejection, not as something you caused, but as a dynamic built on unexpressed limits. And once you see that, you stop chasing the version of the connection that existed before the strain. You stop trying to repair something that was never fully communicated. You stop overextending to hold something together on your own, because real connection does not rely on silent endurance. It requires clarity, expression, mutual awareness of limits. And if one person is carrying everything internally without ever sharing it, the relationship will always reach this point. Eventually, this is the shift. You stop asking, "How do I fix this?" and start asking, "Was this ever fully shared to begin with?" Because you deserve a connection where nothing important has to be hidden, where limits are spoken, where pressure is addressed early, where resentment doesn't have time to build in silence. If this hits something real for you, if you've ever felt that slow shift, that unexplained distance, that moment where everything seemed fine, but something quietly changed, comment, "I felt this" below. Not for the algorithm, for clarity, for awareness, for recognizing that you're not imagining it. And if you want to understand these patterns deeper, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey, because most people only see what happens on the surface, the distance, the confusion, the pullback, but the real reasons, the patterns that create those moments, they happen underneath, quietly, consistently, until you finally see them clearly. And once you do, you stop chasing what confuses you, and you start choosing what actually meets you.